The sun had barely begun to sink when Ryan, Sam, Lily, and Emma stood at the edge of the midnight jungle, its thick canopy casting long shadows even in the late afternoon light. Ryan, the self-appointed leader of their group, grinned wide, hands on his hips as he took in the dark forest stretching before them. "All right, folks, this is it. The legendary Midnight Jungle. I told you it'd be something else, didn't I?" he boasted, his eyes sparkling with excitement. Emma glanced nervously into the dark green depths, her fingers fidgeting with the strap of her backpack. She forced a smile, attempting to mask the slight tremor in her voice. "It looks intense. Are we sure we want to do this?" Beside her, Sam gave her a reassuring nudge, his smile gentle. "Hey, don't worry. We've got Ryan here to lead the way. Plus, it's just a jungle. What's the worst that could happen?" Emma's cheeks flushed at his words. She looked away quickly, hoping he hadn't noticed. This trip wasn't just an adventure for her. It was a chance to be closer to Sam, a chance to see if he felt the same way. Lily, the most curious of the group, laughed and nudged Ryan with a teasing smile. "And here I thought you were just bragging. Looks like you actually found a place that lives up to its creepy reputation." Ryan smirked, proud and defiant. "You know me, Lily. I don't settle for anything less." He looked at the group, his voice filled with that bold energy that seemed to make everyone want to follow him. "All right, team, onward. Adventure awaits." The four friends began their trek, the jungle's dense foliage closing in around them. They laughed and joked as they navigated through twisting vines and towering trees, their voices blending with the jungle's natural sounds. But as they ventured deeper, the light began to fade, and the jungle grew quiet, as if watching their every step. The shadows grew longer, twisting in ways that made even Ryan hesitate. The dark canopy above blocked out the sinking sun, and soon they found themselves walking in near darkness. Emma shivered, sensing a change in the air, a heaviness, as though the forest itself were closing in around them. Did anyone else hear that?" Emma whispered, stopping in her tracks as a faint rustling sound reached her ears. "Probably just an animal or something," Ryan replied quickly, his tone forced. He was trying to keep them calm, but even he seemed uneasy. Lily shrugged, her voice carrying a nervous edge despite her attempt at nonchalance. "Yeah, maybe a monkey or a bird. Or maybe even a bear." She laughed, but it was thin, her usual bravado fading. They took a few cautious steps forward when the rustling came again, closer this time, as if something was moving through the trees around them. Without thinking, Emma reached for Sam's arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve. "Hey, it's okay. I've got you," Sam said softly, glancing down at her with a look that melted her fear, if only for a moment. She managed a faint smile, grateful for his warmth, but quickly released her hold, embarrassed. "Sorry, I don't know. This place feels different," she murmured, her gaze drifting back into the dark jungle. Before Sam could respond, a distant whisper floated through the trees. It was so faint it almost seemed like a trick of the wind. The friends exchanged uneasy glances, their laughter and easygoing confidence now replaced by something darker, something unspoken. Ryan chuckled nervously. "Must be the wind," he said, though his voice was less certain. "Let's just head back the way we came. We're not far." They turned around and walked, their footsteps quiet and cautious. But after what felt like far too long, they found themselves back where they'd started, facing the same twisted tree with gnarled roots, the same fallen log half covered in moss. A heavy silence settled over them as the realization hit. They were walking in circles. "Guess we're making memories, right?" Lily said, forcing a laugh. Her eyes darted around, wide and uncertain. "At least we'll have a good story to tell." Emma's voice was barely a whisper, her eyes fixed on Sam. "I don't want to be here anymore. Something isn't right." Sam placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, his touch lingering, grounding her in the midst of her growing fear. Maybe we should stay put until morning, he said, his voice steady. Wandering around in the dark isn't helping. Another whisper drifted toward them, louder this time, almost like a voice trying to speak through the trees. They instinctively huddled closer, their laughter now a distant memory, replaced by a growing dread that clung to them like the damp night air. Ryan, struggling to hide his fear, forced a grin. Fine. We'll make camp here. But I'm telling you, it's just nerves. This jungle isn't haunted. It's just playing tricks on us. They began to set up camp in a small clearing, but the shadows around them seemed to deepen, stretching out like dark fingers reaching toward them. The dim glow of their flashlights flickered, casting erratic beams that barely held back the encroaching darkness. Emma sat close to Sam, her head resting on his shoulder as she tried to calm her racing heart. She felt his arm around her, a quiet promise of protection. Across from them, Lily watched in silence, her eyes dark with something unreadable. The rustling continued, growing louder with each passing minute. It was as if the jungle itself was alive, closing in around them, a silent predator waiting in the darkness. And as the night deepened, they felt it. The weight of eyes watching, unseen, yet ever present. For the first time, Ryan didn't try to speak, didn't try to lead. He simply sat there, staring into the darkness, feeling the creeping dread settle deep within him. And as the whispers grew louder, mingling with the distant haunting cries of the jungle, they all felt it. A silent certainty that the midnight jungle had claimed them, drawing them into its endless shadows, its dark heart, where no light could ever reach. The daylight was barely there, fading in slivers through the dense jungle canopy as they pushed through the underbrush. Leaves and branches clawed at their skin, the humid air thickening with each step, making it harder to breathe. They were exhausted, and their earlier jokes and laughter were nothing but echoes now, lost in the jungle's suffocating silence. Ryan led the way, his face tense as he scanned the unfamiliar terrain, hoping for any sign of a path. But then, just as they were about to give up and set up camp, his flashlight caught something strange in the shadows. A faint glint, half buried beneath moss and vines. "Wait," he said, stopping abruptly. "What's that?" The others gathered around, squinting through the darkness. As Ryan brushed aside the vines, a stone structure emerged, covered in strange symbols carved deeply into its surface. It was a shrine, ancient and crumbling, yet emanating an eerie power that seemed to pulse beneath the stones. Emma shivered, stepping back instinctively. "What is this place?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Sam's face darkened as he took in the strange symbols, their jagged lines and intricate spirals forming patterns that felt disturbingly familiar, as if they belonged to some old, forgotten nightmare. "I don't know," he muttered, his voice low. "But we should leave. There's something wrong here." But Ryan didn't move. His gaze was locked on the shrine, a strange, almost hypnotic look in his eyes. His fingers traced one of the carvings, lingering over a symbol shaped like an open eye. "It's incredible," he murmured, his voice filled with an unsettling reverence. "It feels powerful." Sam grabbed Ryan's arm, yanking him back. "Are you listening to yourself? Let's get out of here." Emma took a step closer to Sam, instinctively clinging to his side. As he pulled her back from the shrine, their hands lingered together, fingers intertwining for a brief, unspoken moment. Their eyes met, a soft, searching look passing between them, a silent promise in the dark. But Lily's eyes narrowed as she watched them. A spark of jealousy flickered within her, and she turned her gaze away, her expression hardening as she stepped closer to Ryan. Ryan finally seemed to snap out of his trance, blinking as if waking from a dream. He pulled his arm away from Sam, his face flushing with a strange mix of embarrassment and irritation. "Fine. We'll move on. But this place, it's special. I can feel it." They left the shrine behind, but the jungle seemed darker now, the air colder. The trees closed in around them, branches creaking and groaning as if whispering secrets to each other. The sun had set, and the shadows grew thicker, deeper, stretching out like dark tendrils that seemed to follow their every step. They set up camp in a small clearing, but unease settled over them like a heavy blanket. Even the fire's warm glow seemed unable to hold back the shadows that danced around them, flickering and shifting as if alive. Just as they began to settle, a distant, haunting cry echoed through the trees. It was faint but unmistakable, a sound that sent chills down their spines. They exchanged uneasy glances, each of them feeling the cold grip of fear. "What was that?" Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "Probably just some animal," Ryan replied, but he didn't sound convinced. His eyes darted to the darkness, and for the first time, he looked genuinely afraid. Emma clung to Sam, pressing herself close to him. He wrapped his arm around her shoulders, holding her protectively. "We'll be all right," he whispered softly, his voice soothing. "We'll make it out together. I promise." She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. In that moment, they felt a bond forming, something delicate yet unbreakable, a shared promise that neither of them dared to say aloud. But Lily sat apart, her gaze fixed on the two of them. She clenched her jaw, her fingers digging into the dirt beside her as she watched them. The jealousy inside her simmered, growing sharper with each passing second, filling her with a dark bitterness that she couldn't push away. The night wore on, and sleep became impossible as the sounds around them grew louder. Faint footsteps echoing through the trees, whispers that seemed to circle their camp, closing in tighter and tighter. The presence was unmistakable, a heavy, oppressive force that filled the air with dread. By morning they were exhausted, nerves frayed, the remnants of the night's terror still clinging to them. They stumbled forward, hoping daylight would bring some clarity, but the jungle had other plans. The trees blurred together, and no matter how far they walked, they always seemed to end up back at the shrine. "We're going in circles," Sam shouted, frustration and fear cracking his voice. "We're completely lost." Lily crossed her arms, her face twisted with anger. "Maybe if someone wasn't so distracted," she snapped, her gaze flicking pointedly at Emma and Sam, "we wouldn't be in this mess." Emma's face flushed with shock, her mouth opening to protest, but Sam stepped in, his voice cold. "That's enough, Lily. We're all in this together. Blaming each other isn't going to help." The tension between them was palpable, like a taut wire ready to snap. Lily's hands clenched into fists, her face flushed with anger and something darker, something twisted by jealousy and resentment. And then, suddenly, Ryan stopped, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. His face went pale, his expression blank and unreadable as he stared ahead, his body frozen in place. "Ryan?" Sam called, reaching out to touch his shoulder, but Ryan didn't respond. His gaze remained locked on the shadows, his lips moving in a silent whisper, his eyes wide and glassy. And then, without a word, he stepped forward, walking into the dense trees, as if following some invisible guide. "Ryan, stop!" Sam shouted. But Ryan didn't pause, his footsteps steady, unyielding, his movements stiff as if in a trance. Sam ran after him, the others following close behind, but Ryan moved faster, slipping deeper into the shadows. For a brief moment they caught a glimpse of him, his face twisted in a strange, almost serene smile as he reached toward something unseen. Then he was gone. They stood there, staring into the darkness where he had disappeared, their hearts pounding, a heavy silence settling over them. Emma reached for Sam's hand, her grip tight, her face pale with terror. "What's happening, Sam?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Sam pulled her close, his own fear reflected in his eyes. "I don't know," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "But I'm not letting anything happen to you." But as they stood there lost and helpless, Lily watched them, her expression unreadable. Her jealousy, once just a flicker, had turned into something cold, dark, and all-consuming. The night was thick, cloaked in shadows so dense they seemed to press in on them from every side. The fire crackled feebly, its glow barely piercing the darkness that surrounded them. They huddled close, sharing a silence that had become all too familiar in recent days. Ryan sat apart from the group, his gaze fixed on some unseen point in the distance, his face pale and haunted. Sam's voice broke the silence, barely above a whisper. "Ryan, you okay?" Ryan didn't respond. His eyes, wide and vacant, darted over the darkness beyond as if he were searching for something. Then, in a voice that seemed hollow, disconnected, he murmured, "It's calling. I can see it. The way out. We're so close." He stood abruptly, moving toward the trees with a strange, jerking motion. The others scrambled to their feet, calling after him. "Ryan, wait!" Emma's voice shook with fear, her hand instinctively reaching for Sam's. They chased him, tripping over roots and pushing through the tangled undergrowth. Ryan moved with purpose, his movements unnaturally steady as he walked deeper into the jungle. They followed, frantic, their voices growing hoarse as they called his name. But he didn't stop, didn't even seem to hear them. Finally, they found him, standing in a small clearing, his back to them, muttering incoherently. The words came in fragments, half-formed whispers that melted into the darkness. They moved closer, their breaths shallow and afraid, as they tried to make out what he was saying. "It's here. It's been waiting. All this time," he mumbled, his fingers clawing at the air as if reaching for something only he could see. Then, without warning, he turned, his eyes empty, hollow, like he was already somewhere far beyond their reach. And before they could react, he vanished, slipping into the shadows, swallowed by the jungle's endless depths. Panic surged as they searched, calling his name, their voices desperate. But all they found was a torn, blood-stained scrap of his shirt, tangled in the twisted roots of a tree. The sight of it was a punch to the gut, a confirmation of their worst fears. Emma's knees buckled as Sam caught her, holding her tight as she trembled. Ryan was gone. They returned to camp in silence, each weighed down by the same crushing grief. As the hours wore on, Emma leaned into Sam's arms, finding comfort in his warmth, in the quiet strength that seemed to hold them both together. Sam held her close, his voice a soft murmur as he tried to soothe her. "I won't let anything happen to you, Emma. We'll make it out. Somehow." Their faces were close, breaths mingling, and in the midst of their despair, something stirred between them. A silent promise, a bond woven from the fear and grief they shared. Emma's fingers brushed his cheek, her heart racing as they gazed into each other's eyes. For a brief, fragile moment, they found solace in each other, a fleeting respite from the darkness closing in around them. But Lily sat nearby, watching with a dark, smoldering resentment. Her eyes lingered on the way Sam held Emma, on the tenderness in his touch. The jealousy that had been a quiet murmur in her mind grew louder, twisting and coiling inside her like a serpent. In that moment, she didn't just blame Emma for Ryan's disappearance, she hated her for it. As the days dragged on, the jungle seemed to close in tighter. Lily grew distant, her silence heavy, her gaze sharp and calculating. She heard whispers now, faint voices that seemed to drift through the trees, urging her, feeding her darkest thoughts. One night, as they sat around the dim glow of the fire, Lily's composure snapped. She turned on Emma, her face contorted with anger. "This is all your fault," she hissed, her voice laced with venom. "If it weren't for you, we wouldn't be here. Ryan would still be with us. You couldn't just keep your hands off him, could you?" Emma recoiled, shock and hurt flickering across her face. "Lily, I don't understand. I never—" But Lily didn't let her finish. She grabbed Emma's wrist, pulling her roughly to her feet, her eyes blazing with a twisted fury. "You want to lead us all into ruin? Fine. Let's see how far you get." Without warning, She dragged Emma deeper into the jungle, ignoring Sam's shouts as he scrambled to follow. The trees loomed tall and menacing, their twisted branches casting eerie shadows. They stopped abruptly in a narrow clearing, and Lily shoved Emma forward, her face cold and unfeeling. "You don't deserve him," Lily whispered, her voice a deadly calm. Sam caught up to them, yanking Emma away from Lily's grasp, his voice sharp with anger. "Lily, what's wrong with you? This isn't who you are." But Lily only stepped back, her eyes empty, her expression unreadable. She seemed to fade into the shadows, her form melting into the darkness, until she was gone. They called her name, searching, but there was no response. And then they saw her. Lily's lifeless body lay sprawled against a tree, her face frozen in a mask of terror, her eyes wide and unseeing, as if she'd glimpsed something that had stolen her very soul. Now only Sam and Emma remained, their faces pale, haunted. The jungle seemed alive around them, filled with the whispers of their friends, the ghosts of those lost. They walked hand in hand, their fingers intertwined, clinging to each other as they searched for a way out. But each step felt heavier. Each shadow seemed to pulse with life, as if the jungle itself were drawing them in. Sam's voice was a rough whisper, his gaze filled with a desperation Emma had never seen before. "We have to keep going. We'll find a way out. Together." Emma nodded, her fingers tightening around his. She needed to believe him. She needed to believe that they could still escape. But then she noticed it. A strange mark on his wrist, faint but unmistakable, matching the symbols they'd seen on the shrine. Her heart lurched as fear clawed its way up her spine. "Sam, your wrist." He looked down, his face paling as he traced the mark with his fingers. His hand trembled, his eyes meeting hers with a look of dread. But before he could speak, a chill ran through Emma, and she felt his hand slip from hers. She stumbled, her heart pounding as she looked up, only to see Sam's form fading, his body dissolving into the shadows as if he were nothing but mist. "No," she screamed, reaching out, but he was gone, leaving her alone in the dark. Emma wandered through the jungle, her mind numb with grief, her body cold and hollow. She heard his voice now, faint and distant, calling her name. She knew it wasn't real, knew it was a trick of the jungle, a cruel illusion. But she couldn't resist. She followed, her steps slow and deliberate, her gaze fixed on the shadowy figure she thought was Sam. The whispers grew louder, wrapping around her like a shroud, pulling her deeper and deeper until she reached a familiar clearing. She stopped, her heart aching as she realized she was back at the shrine, its dark symbols glowing faintly in the moonlight. In that moment, the truth washed over her. The jungle was cursed, bound to claim those who dared to disturb it. She was part of it now, her soul forever tied to its shadows. As the final whisper slipped from her lips, her form dissolved into the darkness, her voice merging with the countless others who had come before, fading into silence, leaving the midnight jungle undisturbed and waiting for its next visitors.